The April 13th, 2021 financial meeting of the Carlington School District Board of Directors is called to order. Audience member, Ms. Smith, would you mind leading us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Will the secretary please call the roll?
Director Apple?
Here.
Director Honchar?
Here.
Director Mendoza?
I don't believe she's able to make it this evening.
Director O'Brien? Director Pushkar? Here. Director Simsik?
Here.
Director Frank?
Here.
Director Zaletsky?
Here.
And Director Shriver?
Here. Now we'll turn to Dr. Kreider for the Finance Committee agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Shriver. Tonight we have two presentations. We have both Lena Hanna from PSBA and also Dale Kirsch, also from PSBA. They are advocacy ambassadors, and the school district works very closely with PSBA in regard to a lot of our policy making. We rely upon them for different types of advice on some legal policies, budgeting, fiscal affairs, a lot of issues that we're very fortunate to have a strong partnership with PSBA. Followed by that presentation, Mr. Keith Bealby, our Director of Finance and Fiscal Affairs, will have his budget report. So at this time, Ms. Hanna, if you are ready to go, we will turn things over to you, and we should be able to have your PowerPoint pulled up on the screen here momentarily.
Thank you, Dr. Kreider. I appreciate that so much. I will wait till that pops up for just a second, and then I will begin if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So the very first screen should be the one that says student counts and waiting. Perfect. Thank you so much. So good evening, everyone. My name is Lena Hanna. I am the Advocacy Ambassador for the Pennsylvania School Boards Association, as Dr. Kreider said. I have actually been in this role for the last 4 years. I serve Southwestern PA, and in that space, that means I serve 99 school districts in 6 different counties, and any of the state senators and the state representatives that are in those territories. So, but before I begin, I'd first like to thank Director Simsik for reaching out to me to have this opportunity to present to you this evening. I also wanted to thank Dr. Kreider for being gracious enough to share all of the information in advance. And you should have the PowerPoint presentation as well as some information from an article that was written back in about 2016 that kind of really explains the education formula. So before we get started, furthermore, I do want to thank all of you for all of your efforts. As a school board member myself in the South Fayette School District, I've served for the last 11 years. I know how difficult and challenging it has been for all of you, whether you're an administrator, a teacher, staff, parent, students. This has not been an easy 13 plus months. And before I continue on, I think it's really important that I acknowledge that and say thank you for all of your hard work and efforts. So I can appreciate them. And I just think it's really important that you know that folks do really appreciate all your efforts and hard work. So thank you for everything. Before we get started, though, I am going to introduce my fellow ambassador, and his name is Dale Kirsch. Dr. Kreider did mention that earlier. Dale is a former business office manager of 29 years and a former superintendent of 6 years. He also serves with PSBA, and he serves the territory of the Southwestern PA, and he has 74 school districts. I am extremely grateful that he has taken the time to participate in this event with me this evening. His expertise will be invaluable to all of us. So thank you again, Dale, for being here.
Glad to be here.
Lastly, I do want to thank Andy Christ. Andy Christ is PSBA's education policy analyst. He has helped with this presentation as well. He has also graciously agreed that if Dale and I can't answer any of the questions that you may pose, that he too will be gracious enough to answer those for us via email. So we try to have all bases covered for you and through this whole presentation. So thank you again for allowing us to present. And we think that it's probably good to start at the beginning and give you a little bit of history of how this all came to be as far as school funding. So Dale, if you would start us off, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure. And this isn't on the slide presentation, but Lena had asked me to give a little history because I had 35 years in school administration, 4 different districts, and lived through the basic ed funding during all that time as business manager and superintendent. But prior to 1991, we had a funding formula that was primarily based on number of students you had and your relative wealth, factored in by using the market value personal income aid ratio that the state calculated for each district. There were several add-ons and supplements to that over time, some of those for various reasons. But for example, small district assistance was put in for districts with less than 1,500 students. There are many other examples, but and some stayed on, some came and went. And then after 1991, there really was no formula. And districts just received, for a period of years, districts received a increase many years based on your, same thing, based on your relative wealth or lack of wealth. If your aid ratio was high, meaning you were poor, you got, say, 4%. If your aid ratio was low and you're meaning relatively wealthy, maybe you got 2%. So as demographics changed across the state, as you can imagine, some districts were growing, some were declining. No adjustment for that. So districts with declining enrollment were still getting increases if they were, especially if they were poor. But as your enrollment's declining continuously, your costs should be declining, but they kept getting more state funding. And districts that were growing and facing those pressures, though they were likely getting some additional property tax revenue and earned income tax revenue with that growth, they were getting no additional state funding to take that into account. I know you probably have heard about the hold harmless. So in years succeeding that, districts never went backwards. So whatever you had the prior year were guaranteed by the state to receive at least that same amount. So when you have no real formula that takes into account the number of students you have growing, declining, staying the same, things can get out of whack in 2+ decades, and they have. So then the state commissioned a basic education funding commission to take a look at those issues and come up with a new formula that we have today that takes into account how many students you have and the difficulty of educating certain groups of students, whether they be in poverty, whether they be English language learners, et cetera. And so when you come out with this new formula that was passed by a wide margin by the House and Senate, signed by the governor at the time, it showed a lot of disparities had occurred during that 20+ years of no formula to a time now where we're taking into account enrollment among other factors. And so there are many districts that feel that they're really being shortchanged, and I would argue that they are. There are districts who are, you look at the numbers and you would argue that they're receiving way more funding than they should be or are entitled to. They would argue that getting no increase and being frozen is not the best thing, but I would argue that, well, that's better than going backwards. But I also say it's not a new problem. Even when we had the funding formula back prior to 1991, the one factor that was in place then, it's still in place today, and is going to be in place into the future, is how much money the state puts into the formula. That's the limiting factor. You can run all the numbers, and at the end of the day, they're going to say, we're putting this much more money into it, and you run through the formula and everybody gets a pro rata share of that amount. So I was at a district in the late 80s that was relatively poor, and formula would say you're to get an 8-10% increase in your funding, which would have been awesome. But we would be capped at, say, 6% because there was a cap and there was a minimum. And districts, no matter how wealthy they were, if the formula said they were overfunded, entitled to level funding, they would be guaranteed typically 2%. they didn't feel 2% was very much. We were pretty happy getting our 6%, and though 8 or 10% would have been nice, it just didn't feel, at least personally, that someone should be frozen so we could get a more equitable share. You felt, over time it's supposed to work. And I don't think there's anything wrong with having guide rails on there, so no one's not getting a windfall, but no one else is getting a reduction, especially now since Act 1 has passed. Losing state funding is not an Act 1 exception. So districts don't have the opportunity, at least under the current law, to even recover if you lost state funding. So it brings us where we are today with this formula, and where the new money only is being run through the formula. And again, so that, I believe the governor's proposal was $200 million for next school year. That's how much of new money would be generated by this new formula. The governor has proposed, I won't bite into Lena's part of the presentation, but he's proposing a major shift to get additional revenue, because without additional revenue, the inequity is going to take a long time to fix. So you can imagine if you feel you've been shortchanged for 20 years and it's going to take 20 to 25 years to fix it, that's not a good place to be. So that's a little bit of the history. I would just say neither Lena and I are experts on the basic subsidy formula. Lena gives you a really good perspective as a board member and 4 years working with PSBA. And I would consider myself more of a historian, being in 4 different districts and 35 years of seeing what's been done with our state funding. So back to Lena.
Thank you, Dale, so much. So I just want to take a little bit of a deeper dive into the new funding formula and kind of explain a little bit about some of the factors and things that actually go into making the formula. So this first slide kind of shows you, right, the things that the state looks at, and these are kind of like under the student factor space, right? So it's things like the 3-year average DM, which means average daily membership. Then you have 3 different levels of poverty, as you can see on the screen. So the poverty levels. The second one, the 100 to 184, when I asked Andy about that, because as a board member, I tried to look at it as through that lens as to what I thought might be important for you to know, what you might kind of want to know. And that second line talks really about, it kind of gives you an area of where if you had for your free and reduced lunch kids. So that's kind of where they would fall into that second phase there. Then pretty self-explanatory who your English language learners are and who as students you have enrolled in your charter schools. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So that all of that we talked about gives you your 3 years average initially right now is you're just going to see your totals of your number of students. So that's pretty basic and pretty kind of self-explanatory. So we could move to the next slide, please. And that does include, I want to apologize there just for a moment. There, I did have a note on that, but that does include students that are your charter school students as well. So whether they're in cyber and or brick and mortar, those students are counted into that average daily membership. So other things like that I thought would be important. So if I looked at this slide here, I'd want to understand where acute poverty came from. And that space is really given from the federal guidelines. Under poverty, where it's the second column, just regular straight poverty, that's only children ages 6 to 17. That does not look at the whole household. That just looks students in those age brackets. And this data, just so you're aware, is derived from the US Census, really obtained from the American Community Survey data. So that's where the data comes from. The next slide, please.
Excuse me, Lena. So in this grouping, we are the district with the most poverty, even though we have the smaller population than several of these. We have the highest poverty rate, right?
If you're totaling acute poverty and the regular poverty together, yep, it looks, I have to do the math, and I'm sorry, so I'm going to trust you and say when you say that it looks like you have the most there if you're totaling those two together. Is that what you're
Okay.
I would add that the school districts on there weren't so much random. That's the order that they are listed on the PDE reports for Allegheny County.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Please feel free to jump in and ask at that time too. Okay. The next thing, so we get then now to the total poverty average. Looks like Keystone Oaks is a little bit higher than you. And then that's again based off of the Census Bureau based, provided by the same American Community Survey, so nothing that has been reported.
4 parts of Keystone Oaks.
Any questions on that?
Cascade Village. Yeah.
All right, so if you go to the next slide, please.
That's not such a bad area.
So we're talking now about where the English language learners in the Florida schools are coming into, like the factors that are considered into the formula. Again, this data is provided though through reported to the districts through PIMS, which is the Pennsylvania Information Management System. But it is a year or so behind because it does lack in reporting. So just so you're aware of that, but that's where this data comes from. Your district does submit this data. The other data, as I mentioned, does not come from the district. The next slide, please. All right, so this is now how we have our new student weighted number based off of the factors that we talked about. So based off of the poverty, the charters, the English language learners, those are the kinds of things where we get now a new student weighted number. So you can see how your number has changed from the beginning number and now has jumped up to where it is. And you can see the other districts kind of where their numbers have changed as well. Okay, the next slide, please. Now we start to look at some of the school district factors, different than when we talked about specific student factors. So the school district factors, we have none in our area that are under the sparsity one. The median household income, we're going to go a little bit further into greater detail on that in the next couple of slides. The next page, please. All right, so this one here, I want to just read off, and I want to add some things that I had, shared also with you, an article that was written, as I mentioned, in 2016. In there on page 8 from that article, I'm going to reference so that you have that just as a notation that you can place on this page, so that if you're looking for additional information or additional explanations, that you will find it there. So this compares how much a school district taxes its residents compared to the state median. It also compares how much a school district spends per student compared to the state median. So the districts taxing more and spending less are the districts that benefit the best. So, and also from the article, in order to not reward wealthier districts, it makes adjustments for districts spending more than the state median on schools. So the next piece is your local capacity index. And so what it does assume is that every school district taxes its residents at the state median rate, and then determines how much each district, could spend per student at that tax rate. Districts already spending at or above the median receive no adjustment. So additionally, from the article, again on page 8, so you can have it as a future reference, the local capacity index measures how much money a district could spend per student if it taxed its residents at the median statewide rate. Districts that are already spending at or above the median receive 0 on this scale. Very similar to what we talked about, but it does go into a little bit of greater detail within the article. Next page, please. So again, talks about the sparsity. We mentioned that on the slides earlier, that there's no districts in our area that really kind of qualify under that particular factor. The next slide, please. Okay, so here we get a little bit more information and quite a bit actually when you're looking at this. So what I wanted to know again, as a board member, if I'm looking at this, what does this mean kind of to me? So where it says median household index, that comes from the US Census again, from the American Community Survey, and that is updated annually. So that's where that median household income index number comes from. The other piece where it's the local effort capacity index, there are a number of components that come from the school district annual financial reports. There are some components like market value and personal income that come from the state agencies, but they are all state derived numbers. That's where those numbers are coming from. So when I asked Andy about it, because it didn't seem to make sense to me how all of a sudden a school district, if I have a total student weighted ADM and then I'm multiplying, why does the school district why does it go down? So I was a little confused about that. So I thought maybe other folks might be too. And so he told me to really look at that number. So the median household index number, the 1.15 for Carlington and the 0.90, he said to look at those as percentages. So not look at them as just numbers that way, but look at them as a percentage. So that's really like 115%, and then it's 90%. So this might be a little bit more helpful too. He also said that any number over 1 or 100% is going to add to the student count in a positive way. Any number under 1 or less than 100% is going to subtract from the student total. So that kind of plays out in what we're seeing here on the formula, how that actually seems to work there.
Yeah, if I could interject. So Carlington as well as Brentwood Borough, your median household income is lower than the state median, where the other 3 districts, theirs is higher. So it's an inverse relationship essentially. So you're getting a 15.08% bump to the weighted average daily membership number they're trying to calculate for everyone. That ending number is what drives into the formula. Whereas your local effort capacity index, you're losing some formula dollars because you're below 1.0, where 1.0 in each of those cases would be the state median. I can talk a little more about that local. The median household income index is pretty simple. You can't calculate it because they've relied on the census data, but it's yours is where you are in relation to the rest of the state. And then I'll refer back to Lena, but I can provide some more information on the local effort capacity index after she finishes up a little bit more.
Thank you so much, Joe. I appreciate that. And then on the last slide, we kind of talk about then just how things are distributed out. So you can see what Dale had mentioned was the 200,000. Then we add all of those numbers, or all of the districts, the 500 districts factors in, which is that 837,750. All of those are all the districts factors from across the state weighted in there. And then that shows what the district's BEF is going to be. So then you can see that how it plays out. And then you can see that the adjusted student counts are the count numbers that are used, because your number was different from before when you initially started. And then all those factors weighed into it and gave you a new adjusted weighted student count. And then we are going to plan to talk a little bit more in greater detail about the governor's proposal, but I'm going to give Dale an opportunity to go back if he'd like. Would you like him to go back to that slide before, Dale?
Go back to slide 10. I'll try and touch that quickly. But
that'd be great. Thank you.
So again, the local effort capacity index, it's a combination of local effort and local capacity. Local effort means your local tax effort based on your households and other factors. But so in the case of Carlington, you get a factor of 0.9 based on your local effort, which means you're a little bit below the state median on local effort. If you're at 1.0, you're at the state median. If you're higher than 1.0, you're above the state median on how you're taxing your residents. The local capacity index is how much your district is spending underneath the state median. And if you're already above the state median, you get 0. So when I looked at each of the districts on there, including Carlington, you're all at 0 on the capacity index, except for Brentwood Borough does get 0.28 added to their 1.06 that they get for the local effort. So Brentwood is slightly above the state average median tax-wise. They're at 1.06, and their 0.28 they get added because they're under the median on what they spend. Whereas you're already above the state median on what you spend, and then you're a little bit below the state median on what you tax. So that's why that 0.9 reduces your formula number. And if you look at other districts across the state, or even in I looked across Allegheny County, there are some affluent districts that have factors larger than even Brentwood's. And in most cases, I didn't check everyone, but all the ones I checked, it's because their tax effort is high. So it generates dollars for them. Typically, their spending is also high, so they don't get extra dollars for that. So that's probably a tough one maybe to understand. So I want to at least try and explain a little bit about it. So it's two things going into one there. One being your local tax effort compared to the state, and the other is your spending versus the state.
Are there any questions before we move on to kind of explaining a little bit more about the governor's proposal? We can certainly loop back around too at any point in time. So please feel free to, if you think about something as we're going forward. Dale, do you want to kind of start us off again a little bit about the governor's proposal? I know you touched on it a little bit, but if we can.
What the governor has proposed is to address the issue, I believe, of it taking 20 plus years for equity to occur, at least the way this formula is set up. He's proposed a significant tax increase to generate additional dollars to go into the formula. Since the formula was enacted and put in place, it's only been, as I said, the new money. So it's more than 90% of the basic funding still comes through the old formula, which is really based on old data for the most part. And but as I said earlier, it's really what determines what gets driven out by the formula. The biggest factor is how much money is allocated to it. So the new money in this governor's budget is 200 million. But what he's done is taken all the other money has been in there traditionally and running it through the formula, but requiring a tax increase to fund that. And then what they do is they calculate out what your funding should be based on of your old dollars in the new formula, separate from your allocation of the new dollars in the new formula. And in Carleton's case, you're about $400 and some thousand short. If they totally implemented that with no floor, you would lose about $400,000 of existing money when you gain $100 and some thousand from the new money. So there's about 350 school districts, I believe is the rough number, who are in that same situation. So the governor's proposal does include funding to make sure that that no one goes into the negative. And that's because there's a political reality to all of it, that if 350 of 500 school districts were going to lose funding, you can see the challenge of getting the legislature to adopt that.
Dale, I have a question. Does that mean that Carleton is too fiscally responsible?
Well, I'd say you're not overtaxing your residents, at least in general, because it's based on the median. So you're under the median in what you tax, but you are above the median in what you spend. But again, only slightly. So you're pretty good. And in those numbers, you're so close. You're in 1, 2, 3 years that you could flip the other side because you're so close to the median. Did that answer your question?
Thank you, Dale.
And again, that expenditure per median is not based on the number of students you have today, your average daily membership. They take your expenditures and divide it by this new number that's weighted for all those other factors, which you would have never taken into account before. So it's your spending per student on the $1,802 students, not your original 1,400 and some students. But they do that for everyone across the state. But there are districts that are looking at millions of dollars it's more about they're really overfunded when you base the funding on enrollment as much as this formula does. And they've just historically they've had poorer districts who've had decline in enrollment who kept getting funded and funding increases while their enrollment was declining. Because their taxes are probably also significantly below the median as well.
Any other questions or comments that we can address for you?
Dale, I have one question. So charter schools, their costs are all integrated into this. So if any kind of legislation were to pass that would change how Carleton contributes to charter schools, that would change this calculation how it impacts Carleton?
Right. In the near future years, it would adjust your expenditure numbers, but it would for every district in the state. So the more charter school students you have, the impact of your expenditures would be greater than someone who has a small number of charter school students.
And Frank,
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm sorry, is it Jude? I apologize when you.
Jude or Frank
Okay,
can
sorry.
do no wrong.
I get the same. I always get Hannah or Lena. They kind of get that confused too as well. The reason why I'm saying that too is I did ask Andy that question because it's really only 0.2, because I was wondering what that charter school, it really doesn't cover like the full cost of what a district pays for a charter school student. So it's a really small piece of that. So I kind
Right.
of had the same kind of thought in mind too. Does that mean, but yeah, it's a very small fraction of literally what districts do pay out in charter school cost.
Right, I believe it's in the I believe it's in the article about the funding formula that was sent. And the logic is if you lose 5 students to a charter school, your costs are going to go up. You're not typically going to be able to reduce expenses in the home district by losing 5 students across your system. So they put that was a conscious decision made to put a funding factor in there, or a factor in there to give you some credit for that. And again, the more students you lost to charter, the more of a factor you'll get for those.
Good. That helps a lot, because I was just wondering, because it's disproportionate, the effects of someone leaving our school district to go somewhere else, the effect on our actual costs versus, I just wanted to, so it sounds like a lot of the discrepancies, even though they may not be accounted for in how we have to pay out to charter schools, in terms of how that's accounted in this funding formula, they have accounted for it there. It's just how we pay out to charter schools is not caught up yet.
Right, it's a very small piece. It's still not near the dollar amount that districts are spending.
Okay, thank you.
Brings up a good point. I think it's hard to argue against, in my opinion, against tying funding to the number of students. It seems pretty logical. And I think most people would acknowledge that students with higher needs are going to cost a little more, so that all makes sense. I guess you could argue whether it should be the 0.6s or the 0.3s or the 0.2s and all those other, the commission that studied it, and then obviously the legislative process determined all those factors that go into that. And that's probably a part that I guess could be debatable.
Any other thoughts or comments or questions that we can try to answer for you?
I guess one additional thing I forgot to mention. I was on a committee for the Pennsylvania Association of School Business Officials when the commission was doing their work, and the committee I was on, we dedicated our year of that committee's meetings to just running numbers, cranking data on the different things they were talking about, providing data to the commission. Not me personally, but I was part of a committee that was doing it. And still part of that committee, even though I'm semi-retired, but it's still pretty new. So they're looking at what it would look like. And as you can imagine, some of these numbers changed over 20 plus years. They're going to change, maybe not too much from one year to the next, but in the 3-year averaging of the average daily membership helps. But they're finding some concerns on, at least PASBO is, on fluctuations up and down. Still too early to tell, but and what I would say is the state monitors that and looks at that, I would still say there's good logic to having guide rails on it that, maybe someone doesn't need a 10% increase. If you give them significant increases over time, it'll catch them up. And then, but someone shouldn't receive a reduction because, again, you're not able to adjust to that locally with the Act 1 index.
And I think it's fair to say that PSBA has not taken a position one way or another on this due to a lot of factors and unknowns.
And I keep saying one more thing, but I'll say one more thing. You have a, that's my first year as an advocacy ambassador, and Lena has been a huge help to me. So you have a good resource there at your disposal. And, this is a great example of how important advocacy is, because if you're a little bit confused by it, don't feel bad. We're a little bit confused, even trying to figure out all the iterations to it. Don't anticipate all of our legislators understand it either, but they can understand what you tell them the impact on your district is. And at least you want them to know when something's being done, advocate for your district to make sure they at least know what the impacts may be, so they're informed before they decide.
Thank you, Dale, for that. It's so well said.
I have a question to either or both of you. Since you're closer to Harrisburg than we are, it looks like that the fiscal mismanagement at Peasers is finally going to be addressed. Please give us your thoughts.
So the only piece that I know of, well, I know what you're talking about because of the newest thing that just came out regarding it. I don't have any more information further than just having that been released. The other piece that we knew from before is just basically how it was new hires. They made the adjustments there, and that's kind of where things were helpful, but not necessarily for folks that had already been within the system. Dale, am I incorrect?
And I don't know that we know much more than you do at this point. As Lena mentioned with the new hires, their rate is based on Peasers returns. So if Peasers doesn't have that great of returns, the new hire, their contribution rate goes up. If they have good returns, their rate can go down. They have a high and a low. So I believe they will be impacted if this comes out to be true. But if there's other additional impacts that I'm just not sure yet.
Yeah, I apologize. We just don't have that, but we can run that back up the chain for you. We can ask Andy and see if there's something that PSBA knows a little bit more about, and we're happy to get back to you with that.
Right, and then on the employer side, your contribution by the returns as well. So that if their returns are not what they were, the rate that they set in December of 2020 may be too low, and it could result in a little higher increase than was anticipated going forward.
Thank you very much for your input.
Lena, one thing that you had mentioned was the variety of tools that are used to collect the data that go into the different formulas. One of those was our PIMS data. Another was census data. And then you had also mentioned other information that's collected on a yearly basis. Could you explain what that data is, how that's gathered on the yearly basis?
Yeah, the only thing that I knew from what I'd gotten from Andy, because I did ask that question, wanted to know, he said it comes from the U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey, and that is updated annually.
The other piece is your annual financial report, I think is what.
Yeah, the financial report, right. Mm-hmm.
Your revenue and expenditure data comes right off your annual financial report. You submit to BDE.
Was that Dr. Kreider? Were you asking?
Yeah, yes, it was. Yeah, and I was just curious with so it's the American Community data, and that would be used to calculate median household incomes.
Yes, that's what he said it was used for, was the median household income index. And I'm just looking back through my notes here just to see where else he had mentioned that as well, that it was taken into account. I think there's one other area that I mentioned that it was.
The youth and poverty metrics too.
I think so. I think that's where, yes, because the districts weren't reporting that. The districts were only reporting the English language learners and the porters. Thank you for that, whoever said that. I'm sorry, we can't necessarily see who that is, so thanks for the help. Any other thoughts or comments? I know we've gone a little bit longer than we thought, but it's so good. It's great discussion. And if we can help in any way, we're certainly happy to do that.
This is Chris Simsick. I just wanted to take a moment to really thank you for putting this presentation together for us. It's very helpful, and I know you put a lot of time into it, so we do appreciate it.
Oh, thanks. Actually, I learned quite a bit from it, so I was really glad for the opportunity as well. So thank you for giving us that opportunity too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'll just put a quick plug in. Mr. Andrews, good to see you. It's been a few years.
Dale, I was just about to jump in and say I have a question, but I know as a former superintendent, you never like to hear that. So how are you doing? It's good to see you.
Doing well, keeping busy.
Good, glad to hear that.
35 years was enough. I'll just say that.
I'm not going to tell you how many I'm going on, but it's a few more than 35.
I'm sure. Okay. All right, all. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your meeting.
Enjoy your evening. Thank you again, and thank you for all you're doing for your students and your staff and your communities. It is appreciated. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you again, Lena and Dale, and we'll be sure to keep in touch if we have any follow-up questions with you as well. At this time, we'll transition over to Mr. Bealby, who has our updated budget report.
hear me all right? Make sure it's on. Thank you, Dr. Kreider, and thank you to everyone. Once again, we're going to take a look at our budget. The only difference is from the past couple of meetings that we've been doing the budget, we've been looking at the current budget. So tonight, we're actually going to start switching to the next year budget. The budget season is deeply into its time right now, so we really have about a month before we have to come up with a proposed final budget. And this really is a good place to start. And what I'm going to do tonight is just basically give you an update on where we are with the revenue budget. And since, there are several different parts in the whole budget, I think it's easier to break it up. So what we'll do is cover revenues tonight, and then the next meeting we'll go over expenses, just so it's not too much and too involved. Tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the revenues that we have projected, and we've also looked at some of the challenges that we're going to face. This is not the final revenue budget. It's going to change. We're going to see changes as things happen and as things evolve, and I'll explain that, especially when it comes to the state budget and different other things that we need to look at. Let's see what else. But what this is, it's really going to be a pretty close representation. So like I said, there will be some changes. We're going to continue working on it. So if anytime you have any questions, comments, please stop me and jump in. So let's go ahead and next slide. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we've been faced with many unknowns and revenue shortfalls in the current and upcoming year. Unfortunately, these challenges are not just in one section of the budget. They span throughout the revenues we receive from the local, the state, and even the federal government with their many rounds of stimulus money. The state, for example, is still struggling to balance their budget without the help of federal money. And unfortunately, the budget is unable to adequately fund the schools without the influx of this federal money. As Dale and Lena just stated, Governor Wolf is trying with his latest budget to increase the funding, but the way he's trying to do it is he's looking at other taxes to fund the schools. So that's a pretty big task that he has to face. You're basically taxing one way to get some more money to the schools, but that's what he's going to try to do. He's looking into this fair funding formula, which as far as what we have seen, it's going to help us a little bit. We're not going to be, as Gina stated, one of the big winners, because there are some big winners and there are some big losers. But the good thing is that with the hold harmless is that we will always get what we had the previous year. So it's pretty easy to say, okay, we can budget this way, and you'll see when we go to the state budget how we go ahead and budget it. So, if he can equalize this playing field, like I said, there's some winners, there's some losers. We're right about in the middle of it. So, and then finally, with charter school reform, that'll be discussed probably at the next meeting. But that's going to be a big impact on the district, and how we will be able to, if we don't have to spend all the money that we are on charter schools, then we can utilize this revenue for better purposes.
Keith, forgive me for interrupting, but so as far as like charter school funding reform, are you feeling like getting any kind of sense that we're making progress on that, or that's something that could happen? Because I don't know that I'm quite hearing that.
There has been some talk into it, and they are starting to look into it more than they have in the past. And the problem that we had in the past is we had a Secretary of Education that actually had students in charter schools. So that to us, when we look at that, is how much was he really pushing to take that charter school money for back in the regular school. That's just from what we conducted from listening to some of his speeches, and this was 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. But like I said, there's been more pushed by PASBO, by CSBA, by the different organizations, And a lot more school districts and school boards are passing resolutions that are going to the representatives, telling them, hey, this is hurting us. This is something that we need to look at and change. So I think it is starting to gain more momentum than it has in the past. Is it going to pass? Probably not. But even if we can get some portions of it, the total reform probably is not realistic. If they can at least equalize the amount of money that we have to pay. Right now we're paying approximately $32,000 for every special ed student. And I think we're at 14,000 for regular students. It doesn't cost $32,000, $32,000 to pay a special ed student. And they have ways, and we all know, of taking a regular ed student and putting an IEP on them to get that extra money. So that's what we really want to change, is that they have a standard rate that's fair to all districts, same for every district, every charter school, that will make it feel more equitable for us. Because right now, it's not. It's just basically throwing money out the window, and it's money that we need to use here. It really is. And it's not constant. That's exactly right.
Okay.
They're definitely not.
Thank you.
So, the tax governor was very impressive. There's Dale also very unlike a lot of the initiatives that not but we'll wait. But that's really one of the biggest unknowns. It's not an uncommon trying to figure out how much money they're actually budgeting. So that's where they got to, it makes it a little bit easier because we know we have to start. That's how.
Hey, Keith, I'm having a really hard time hearing you.
Okay, me. All right, George, can you hear me okay now?
That was Jude.
Yeah, it's Jude. Yeah, I can hear you now.
Sure,
Great.
sorry.
Thank you. Yep. Problem solved. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. So far, we have received 3 rounds of federal stimulus money. They have been the FF1, and we've received 2 PCCD grants. That's totaled approximately $500,000 for the district. We are currently working on coming up with how we're going to spend the SH2 grants that have been just currently offered out to the district. These grants have helped us in many ways to weather this pandemic, covered the PPE that we needed, helped get computers to our staff and students, and other initiatives to ensure that our students continue to receive their great education experience that they're used to getting. Without that money, it would have been a struggle for the districts to be able to give them the tools and the ability to even have by getting the computers out, keep everyone safe. Really good. The only thing I have to caution you is that these grants are not for the district. Many people think that it's free money for us, but we can't spend it however we want. There's strict guidelines of what we can spend it on. We have to adhere to those guidelines, and unfortunately, we just can't just randomly pick an expenditure or say, all right, we're going to pay for this and fund our fund balance, and throw our fund balance.
Hey, excuse me, Keith. Your audio is again bad. It's in and out.
All right, let me try another line.
It was good for a while.
All right, let's try this one. How's this?
That's excellent. Thanks.
All right. All right. So, like I said, with these ESSER grants, we can't we can't look at them as a windfall. We have to, use them effectively, and we have to be very creative. So that's why with the ESERS 2 and ESERS 3, we're going to really sit down as a group and come up with the best plan to be able to maximize the usage and the benefits of these grants. Next topic was earned income. We've already talked about earned income a couple times in the last couple meetings. It's still trending a little bit short of the budget this year. Some of the months our collections are up, some months they're down. So it's really hard to gauge where we're going to be. I believe we're going to be close to what we budgeted for this year, but it's something that we need to really watch over the next couple months to be able to gauge. And the number that I will show you in a few minutes might have to change based on what we see over the next few months. And also the next thing, we've had very little to no athletic and fine arts ticket sales. And that's, a direct reflection of the pandemic and not having the schools open and available. It also, includes rental, people using our facilities. And then the interest income, that's probably one of the bigger ones that has taken a big hit. The interest, there's just not interest out there. Last year, we collected $172,000 in interest. This year, we might make $15,000. That's about it. So it's a really big hit. So that's something that we have to watch all these areas here over the next 3 months, because these are really some of the biggest unknowns and possible shortfalls. And we don't want to fall into that trap that if we just ignore them, that next year, if this pandemic continues or the trend continues the way the revenues are coming in, then we just don't want to have that issue. So now let's take a look at the revenue budget for next year. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the major funding categories and the biggest revenue sources in each group. I'm not going to go through every line item in the budget, but what I did, you might have received earlier in your email, and also for those of you that are here, I did give you a revenue budget that does have a historical. I think the ones here only go back a couple years, but the emails that I gave you gives us history back almost 10 years. And it also has where we are as of today with our revenues, or as of March 31st. And then it has the budget in there. So it kind of will give you an idea of the different little items, line items, because there are a lot. But there are 4 major categories, function categories that we are held to, and this is how we budget. The first one is the 6,000s. That's the revenue collected within the boundaries of the school district. So basically we call that local sources or local revenue. Then you have the 7,000s. That's the revenues that originate from the state government appropriations, state subsidies. That's the state sources, state revenue. And then the 8,000s are your revenues originating from the federal government, and I'm sure you all know what we call them. They're the federal sources and federal revenue. And then finally, there's the 9,000s, and the 9,000s are not used too often, but what that is for the category for long-term debt proceeds. So if we create a bond issue, you'll put your proceeds into the 9,000s. If you have big interfund transfers or transfers in, that'll go in there. Or if you sell any of our assets, that will go into that budget there. Go ahead, next page. So taking that, this screen here, basically, it shows us, this is Carlington right here. This shows us where does our money come from. And I know you've all seen this before, and you do realize that 68% of our money comes from the local sources. It's a big chunk, and only 30% comes from the state and 2% from federal and other. And the biggest thing about this is that, because we are so dependent on our residents, it's very important that we do whatever we can to maintain our costs and ensure that we maximize this revenue that we're receiving from them and effectively flow it into the students. So this, to me, is how I have to really think about when I do the budget and I do the expenditures, because it's impacting you, it's impacting the residents more than any other
budget part of it, basically.
Sorry to interrupt. Quick question. The 2/3, 1/3 split roughly. Historically, has that been similar here and across the state, or is that something that has skewed over the last 20, 30 plus years?
I think that you're seeing more over the last 20 years or so of a shift to the local sources. As we all know, with the state budget problems that they've had over the years, that chunk is getting smaller and smaller, and that is really the reason why we are at that point now where they have to look at this fair funding, because it has gotten so out of bounds and out of the parameters are just. We could be basically the same as another school district right next to us, but the amount of money that we receive from the state could be tremendously different, but based on the past. So, yeah, I would say that there has been a shift.
I recall reading something a couple of years ago that it used to be about a 50-50 split, maybe 30 years ago. Dr. Kreider, you're shaking your head. Does that sound right? Okay.
No, you're absolutely right.
Okay.
It was there was a lot more equity, and even the federal government did put in a little bit more money in the past. But
so that puts a huge burden on our local tax base to try to support.
Right.
And that's not just Carleton, that's across the state.
That's across the state. Absolutely. Right. And that's why, these issues, the charter school reforms, the fair funding, all these issues have compounded more now because school districts are struggling to get that extra, revenue, because you don't want to have to keep taxing and taxing and taxing just to operate based on what the state, decides, the governor decides with their budget. So, yeah, it's very difficult to look at this and say, look at how much we have to depend on our residents in our community to support the school. So, you're right. You're absolutely right. It's a big challenge every day that we look at it, and it's just something that we have to just keep focused on. That, this pie chart is, it's us. It's our school. This is how we have to look at our budget. It really is. Okay. I think next slide. So if you take that revenue and with this here, if you look at where is the money coming from, local sources include the real estate tax, the earned income tax, delinquent taxes, interest, others, interest, your states, your subsidies, your transportation reimbursements, your retirement and Social Security subsidies, and your federal is your Title I, Title II programs, your access programs. But if you look at that chart that I have, if you look at the yellow, that is our real estate tax. So that is exactly, that is where the majority of our money, and I think what comes out to, let me see, 56% of our total revenue is coming from the local tax, from our real estate tax. So that's huge. That's a huge number. There's nothing else that really comes into comparison to that one single item. So that's really a good view of, again, you have the pie chart and the other one showing the overall, but this just breaking it down so that that where is that money really hitting us, and that's what it is. Real estate tax is big. Earned income's the next one, and if you look at the state, that's the total state. That is smaller than just earned income and actually it's smaller than the real estate tax alone. So that's a telling chart for us. Any questions on that? All right. So now let's go ahead and look at each of the different revenues, where we anticipate that we are and going to be for next year. As I stated, the real estate collections are by far the largest source of funding in our budget. Represents 56% of our total revenue and impacts our residents the most. And what I have here is I'm showing that we have an increase for next year of $949,083. That increase does require us raising taxes to the index, which is 3.7% this year, or 0.94 mils. But on a good note, part of that number too is that our assessments have increased in the last year, which is showing that the community is still growing and is thriving. So that number, like I said, right now it does include a tax increase, but right now I think it's important to start at the worst, come with our expenditures when we do that part of the budget, see where we are, and then we'll come to you and say, okay, here's our options. So worst case, it's not worst case, but for the residents it is, but for us, it's increasing it to the max. The pandemic really has not affected the collections to date. We stated last couple of weeks, we have received the budgeted amount that we budgeted for this year. So it might be something that we might want to look at the collection rate and increase it for next year. It's something that I'm going to try to do an analysis over several years to get what our true collection rate is compared to what Chris stated as our pandemic collection rate, and see if it is logical to raise it. I'm having a feeling the way that we might be able to raise it, but that's something that's in a future budget. Earned income, I have $101,950 increase, so up to 1.9 million. Even though I feel that it's going to come up possibly a little short or maybe right at the limit or right at the budget, I'm optimistic that it's going to rebound next year. It's a real gradual and modest increase, but it's not near the $2 million collection rate that we've had over the last 5-6 non-pandemic years. So that too, like I stated earlier, we can relook at that as our collections come in. So if our collections continue to come in like we're expecting and we get closer to budget, then I think that that's more realistic. If for some reason our collections stop over the next couple months, or we really miss that budget, then we will lower that down. So that's why I mean that this budget, this is not the final. We're going to constantly keep looking at it. We're not just going to put it to bed after tonight. Our delinquent tax collections have been steady, so I haven't done any change to that. And I'm also optimistic that as more people are getting vaccinated and more people are getting comfortable, I think more activities are going to open up to the schools. I think we then will be able to start hosting our plays, our sports again, our different events that we have. And while that revenue isn't that much in the big scope, it's still money, and it's needed. It really is. It's needed for the culture and just to have the people, their morale to get back into their schools and do things. So, so basically, what I'm looking at with the budget is that the local budget is currently we're at $19,355,000.
I think we lost them. Craig, I can't hear you right now. Or Keith, I can't hear you right now. Can anyone else hear me?
I hear you, but I don't hear anybody else.
I can hear you, but I can't hear the presentation.
Okay, I think we lost. I can see Michelle. I can see Keith's computer, but I think we lost the main recording.
I can only see you and I see Michelle now.
Anyone hear me?
I can see George out in the
Yep.
sun, but
We can hear you, Michelle. We just
Yes.
can't hear Keith.
Oh, Keith is on,
We lost internet connection here.
Keith is
So-
on mute for some reason.
We,
We cannot hear Keith.
He's on mute.
okay. Yeah, we're back.
Can you hear us now?
No, yeah.
So is that a yes? We got, okay. All right, so let me go back
Say. I think it said on and say, but yes.
on and save. Okay. So back to the state revenues. We just started on this. Basically, from what I stated, that we kept this budget flat based on the many unknowns that I discussed earlier in the presentation. And, you know, we know that we're going to get at least what we got the previous year. So we're going to start there as our basis. And as we get more information of how the budget's going with the state, then that's another one that we will adjust at the last minute, you know, for any increases that we might get. But we're safe right now with state, and that we're going to be flat for the basic ed subsidy, the special ed subsidy, the property tax reimbursement. I do have one little decrease in that state budget, and it's due to basically the adjustments of Social Security and the retirement subsidies that are tied to our salaries. That's a small part of it. And also, I took out some of the grants that we talked about earlier that we have received that are no longer valid. So that's why you see a decrease. So we're taking the state revenue from $9.3 million down to 9.0, which is a decrease of 208,000 or a 2.24% decrease. Any questions on the state? Okay, next. Federal revenues, just like the state, tend to be flat year after year. The Title I, Title II, Title III, Title IV, pretty much every year we're getting the same amount. So we'll continue to budget it until we see any change. The access fund drawdown has been reduced. Is basically the only reason why it was reduced a little bit is that the availability of our pot of money that we have at the Pennsylvania Department of Education has dwindled down a little bit just because of the amount of access reimbursements that we have turned into the state. So that basically what happens is that as we run our access program, we fill out all of our quarterlies and a final report every year of all the expenditures that are tied to the access program and treating the Medicaid eligible kids. That money in turn is thrown into a bucket of money at the Pennsylvania Department of Education, and that money will just sit in there and will just stay and do nothing until we actually have to physically take the receipts that we submitted, send it to them, and then they actually send us money. So that's why we're showing, you know, there'll be a little bit of a decrease for that. But in years to come, you know, as we build it back up, we'll increase how much our access is for that. And really the biggest decrease is the $458,000, which is another one of the ESSER grants that we had that are no longer being used. So federal revenues are going from 1.28 down to 778,000. It is a decrease of 508,000, and it's a 39.5% jump. But that also shows to you that, you know, by putting that one-time grant money into a budget, you're going to see year to year big decreases or increases based on which way you're going to put your budget. So it's an accounting thing that we have to work on to see what's the best way of doing it. Dr. Kreider and I have talked about it, that we know how much we have coming for our ESSERS grants, but if we put it into our revenue, it's going to inflate our revenue. But we'd also have to inflate our expenditures for that same amount, not knowing what we're going to spend it on. So it really washes itself out. So my philosophy is I think it's almost better not to put it in there so that we are consistently using our known revenue that we get year to year to year. And one thing that will show that on the upcoming slide is, you know, what the effect is that when you have a revenue that's higher, you start seeing dips in your history. So that's something that, you know, I'll do whatever, you know, the board wishes. If you want to see that in there, we can put that in there. But then, you know, like I said, we can just make a bucket of money in the expenditure side for that amount and then allocate it as we spend it, or we just keep it as is, knowing that we have it. We'll run it through a balance sheet so that it'll still be reported that we have it. It's just it won't be on our revenues or expenditures at this time until we actually use it. So that's something that we can discuss. We still have time, you know, but I think that this is probably the cleaner way of doing it. And you, Dr. Kreider, you agree? I think that's the way we should approach it. Okay. Okay, so that's the federal. So if you look at our overall revenue budget, our local revenues increased and those numbers are basically the numbers that I just spoke to you. So we are taking our budget from 2021 of 29,945,426, and we're going to raise it to 30,361,572. So that net change is a $416,000 increase, or a 1.39% increase over the previous year. And if you look at the report that I sent home, and I'm not sure if it's on the report that you have here, if you look at the historical data over the years, the district's been right around 1.3, 1.5, 2% increases year to year. So by looking at that, it's pretty much in line of how it was in the past. So I know that we're pretty close to being in the ballpark of where we should be for the district. So that's what we have right now for our revenue summary. Like I said, that's not going to be the final number that you're going to see, and we're going to revisit it, you know, over the next few meetings. So right here is with the little bit history of where we've been and where we're going with our revenue. As I stated earlier, if you look at that first line from 2010-11 to 2011-12, that's the only real decrease in our revenues over our history. We've gradually been going up slowly. And that's really because of the ERA money that, you know, the stimulus money back in that day, that we had, that was reported in there, and then the next year they took it out. So as you see, there's a dip. So that's where I'm concerned that, you know, like I said, either way, it doesn't really matter which ways, but, you know, you're going to have either a nice little revenue history that's going to show us, you know, our real trend of how our revenues have increased, or you're going to see some up and downs on those years that are bad. Either way, I don't, you know, think is wrong, but it's just, you know, how you guys feel as a board on how you want it reported. And then let's see, go ahead, next slide. So once again, you know, these are just kind of like a reminder of that first one of, you know, what are some of the issues that we still have to keep looking at every single time that we look at this revenue. You know, we have to look at those shortfalls, the interest income. Do we feel that we're going to get some more admissions? The uncertainty from the state. historically the increases are 1%, but right now I don't see that we might not even get a 1% increase. So, that's something that we'll have to watch as the budget goes on. Federal state COVID relief must be expensed. Like I just stated, that we have to, make sure that we're spending it in the correct parameters of it. And that's exactly what I have there in the new stimulus disbursements. We're starting to get a clear picture of what we can use the money on, but it does change quite often, of what we can do it. But once we have those parameters, once we sit down with that and we can say, okay, what is the best thing? Do we want to replace windows? Do we want to do some capital project plans that we were planning that we can do? Do we want to put more money into closing that educational gap from the kids being out? So there's a lot of different things that we're going to have to really sit down with all the administrators and with the board and say, okay, how do we want to effectively spend this budget? So
Quick question. On the stimulus money, the parameters, directionally, we have a pretty good idea of the categories that we're allowed to spend it on.
Right.
There might be some fine tuning of that, but we have a decent feel
do.
for what we can do with it, right?
Right.
Okay.
We do.
All right. Thanks.
And it is just going through it, combing through it and saying, okay, of these 50 or 60 parameters that they have or different eligible things, what is going to make the most effective for us as a district, so that we're not just frivolously throwing stimulus money onto expenditures without thought. So that's a big challenge over the next few months for all of us to be able to do that. So that's basically, just a quick brief overview of where the revenues are that we're projecting, the issues that we're facing. Revenues are pretty consistent year to year, so it's not too hard to come close to where you are in that first pass. You just have to tweak it based on the different issues that are affecting, especially with us, with being such a dependent on the local community. We have to be abreast of what's happening with the economy or what's happening with our community, so that we do budget it correctly, or we don't overburden the community with that. So that's what I have for right now. Any more questions, comments?
I do have a couple questions, Keith.
All right, Jim.
The first is to what extent does our funding, to what extent does that funding, how is it tied to our salaries, right? So if our salaries increase, it's really just tied to the PSERS and benefits. It's not really tied to the base salary, right? So if our salaries right now, our total personnel costs are 72 to 73% of our school budget.
Right.
Say that goes up, we have a $30 million budget, something along those lines. If that goes up by $4 million over the next couple of years, the revenue increase is not going to be tied to the base salary. It's only going to be tied to that percentage that is the benefits, right?
Right. Exactly. The only thing that will be tied to that is, any increase in the PSERS contributions, the Social Security contributions. That's really going to be the only effect, is that we'll get more money based on spending more money. So it kind of, it's a double-edged sword type thing where, you're going to spend more money to get a little bit more money. So, and it really doesn't even out. You're absolutely right.
And if we look at what we control in terms of if there's a difference to be made up, it's going to be made up in well, first of all, so nothing from state or federal is tied to that, right? So the difference would have to be made up locally.
Right. Other than from the state, the PSERS and the state subsidy, you're correct. Everything else would have to come on the backs of the local community and the local revenue that we have. You're absolutely right.
And so locals already, from your presentation, I think you showed it was about 67%. And of that, 56% of the total is real estate tax. The rest is, the majority of the rest is what earned income tax and other stuff, but real estate is really what we control. And
that's
so correct. That the difference really comes on the back of the real estate tax.
That's correct. And the only other way, if you're staying with just the revenues, yes, that is. But the only other way would be when you start having to look at cutting expenditures, and that's, cutting staff, cutting programs, everything that we don't want to do. But as the costs increase, that's one thing that we have to look at and be aware that could happen, because
Right,
we are
and
we're very
Yeah.
limited.
And for the last couple of years, we've been raising taxes to index. We can't
Right.
do that indefinitely. And what
Right.
I guess my point is, when we're looking at it over the next 3 to 5 years, our costs are going to go up, but the costs that are going up is not going to be something that is offset by federal and state taxes. The
Correct.
only thing that could offset it is local taxes, and it's the real estate taxes that is going to bear the brunt of it, and we're already raising those to index. So I
You're
guess that's the
absolutely
only point I wanted to make.
right, and you're absolutely right.
And that's not something we can do.
Right. Any other questions? Okay. Feel free to reach out to me at any time if you have any questions. Look at that spreadsheet that I sent to you. It's pretty eye-opening, and it will give you a little more clear picture of where we come up with the numbers that we do. Like I said, the numbers that I showed you were really probably the top 3 of each different function, but that will take you down to every single level of every revenue that we receive. So thank you, and we'll keep pushing on.
Yeah. Thank you, Keith. Mr. Shriver, that's the end of our reports for this evening.
I'll offer any board member the chance to ask any last questions. If not, I guess I'll entertain a motion to adjourn if we need one.
So moved.
All right. Give a
Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, nay. We are adjourned. Thank you.